Hey guys, my name is Mike, and wanted to touch base on some things that I've run into while I was installing some comp cams on my particular vehicle. Was the '07 Mustang GT California Special. Has the 4.6 3-valve in it, and it has quite a few mods done to it, including the Vortec V3 HO kit, 373 gear, McLeod Racing clutch, delete plates, a couple of other bolt-on things that have made pretty good power over the past, I'd say, 5 years. I had the Brinspeed cams, the Detroit Rockers. It was the blower grind, and I'm also running the illuminator block on this car. It's the fully forged illuminator motor. And back in December, cruising down the interstate, and all of a sudden I heard a really odd noise, and it wasn't too far from the house, and I was able to get home, but it lacked in power. It had a really odd sound, almost a 2-cycle type sound. And once I got to the house and got to, where I could take the valve cover off, it was mainly on the left side, the driver's side. This is what I found. When I popped the valve cover, I noticed that there were rocker arms laying all over the place, as you can see in the picture on the left there. Top right of that head, there's a rocker arm laying up there. There's another one sitting next to the other intake valve. And then on the picture on the right, you'll see several rocker arms that are cam followers, whatever your preference would be to call them, laying about inside the head there. Obviously, that's not where they belong. And also, I noticed that the rocker, or the cam hold-down bearing caps were snapped in half, right down the middle. 3 out of the 5 were actually broken completely in half. So obviously, it wasn't holding the cam down where it needed to be. So as I got to looking around, I pulled everything apart. We ended up pulling the whole motor and everything. But once we got down into there, we looked at the journals and just the color of everything really showed that there was an oil starvation issue. And I did have an oil overheating issue here not too long ago. But you can see the galling of the journals on the left-hand picture there. You'll see that it's scored quite a bit, and some actual metal fragments down there next to the lash adjuster. And then in the right-hand picture there, you'll see that there's actually chips out of the head where the journal would ride. And so obviously there were some major issues. So what caused all this to fail? Obviously it was my fault. Lack of proper maintenance, overheating, and then on top of that some high RPM, which I had just gotten on it getting onto the interstate. Nothing real crazy, but as you can tell by the color of that oil, it was long overdue. So we went ahead and pulled the entire engine out of the car. It was easiest to get to, and I was going to go ahead and throw another clutch into it anyhow. The center force clutch that I had in there before, can't say that I was ever really pleased with it, so I decided just to go ahead and go through it all and get it all done. So this is what it looked like once we had the heads off. I can't say that it looks really terrible. I mean, there's a normal amount of carbon, and what we are most really pleased with is we can actually still see the crosshatch marks within the cylinder walls. And this engine has about 55,000 miles on it, I guess now, somewhere in that ballpark. But we were quite pleased, and it wasn't as bad as we thought, and thankfully there was no piston to valve interference. So the cylinder head, this obviously is the valve side, and this is the head that was the worst. No evidence of any kind of real damage to it, but the head, in my opinion, was totally shot. We weren't going to reuse it. We'll just go ahead and source some other ones, but this is what it looked like. And again, you can see the disgusting oil there, and I didn't see any evidence of head gasket breakdown or anything like that, where, you know, blown head gasket or anything like that that might have precipitated anything. Okay, so these are the numbers on the pistons of this illuminator block. Come find out, you know, they're all forged, and everything is pretty good quality in this motor. And from my understanding, it can take quite a bit of abuse, as in you know, nitrous and much higher boost than what I'm pushing. I think I'm pushing around 12 to 15, 16 pounds, something like that. So nothing crazy, but they're pretty good pistons from my understanding, and also has the H rods and that type thing in it. So once we started getting everything cleaned up, it was, you know, evident that everything was okay in there. I said we didn't see any major issues. So we went ahead and got everything cleaned up, that part. So went ahead and got some new remanufactured heads. We sourced them locally, and were able to get them in about 2 weeks. And I just went basically back with the stock style heads, and I would do some porting and polishing on them and that type of thing. And it would need some additional work before we could put the actual big cams in it from Comp. Okay, so these are the cams that I went with. These were the 127-650, and they required that we use the extra spring strength in order to make it you know, safe for higher RPMs. These apparently work from about 4,500 or 4,800 up to about 7 grand. And then also we had to use the cam phaser limiters. That was number 5449. They're not the lockouts, but they are limiters. They limited the timing to about 20 degrees, where I believe prior to that it goes up to like 50 or 60, something like that. But these are the cams that I went with, the Extreme Energy cams. I believe it's the biggest cam they have for this particular motor. So once we got to prepping the heads, we had to go into it and do some relief to make sure that the springs were going to fit in, the heavier springs. When we put those in, we were ending up with some binding on the side of the head, right next to where the spark plug is, and also where the lash adjusters were mounted in there. So we had to pull back some of that with a grinding tool, and made plenty of room for them. That way they wouldn't bind when they were compressed. But the compression on these are about 275 to open and 120 seat pressure. So while we were in there, we just went ahead and did everything that we needed to do. Okay, so these are the new Comp springs. I forget the exact number, I'd have to look. But pretty heavy duty springs. When we first got these heads, we took them apart, and obviously we're going to switch the springs and everything. When we got to looking down in there, we found some pretty crappy work done. As you can see in the right hand picture, there's some of the actual seals were torn. They were, you know, ripped up at the top. There were some that didn't have the springs around the top of them, as you can see in that picture. There's 3 just in the right-hand picture. It didn't have the springs on them, and then some of them you can obviously see that they're torn as well. So they did a real crappy job putting that together, and I'm glad that I got to look into the heads that far and catch this type of poor craftsmanship. So some of the valves, once we were in there, we noticed they were upside down. We couldn't believe that they had actually put these things in upside down. These are conical springs. So when you get to actually looking at them, you can tell that the base obviously is wider than the top, and the flat area that you see sticking out of the side underneath the retainer, that obviously should be down instead of up. And there were several we found that way. Not to mention that the blue capped bolts that you see there for the cam hold down, they were actually finger tight, and those should be down to 89 inch-pounds. And some of them weren't all the way even down, and some were just barely finger tight. So I'd give the company a call about that, and they said they would investigate, but who knows. So finally we got it down to the bare head, and this is where we went ahead and did some relief around the areas right in this area here, where the spring would actually touch on the side of the journal towers here. We had to be careful because these are oil galleys here, but we were able to grind this area out up here, and made quite a bit of progress with a special grinding tool that we had, a little pneumatic grinder. It did real well, and didn't take too terribly long, but just wanted to make sure we didn't get too deep into the metal there and cause any kind of issues. So the specifications on the cam, as you can see there, these are the blower grind, and it's a stage 3 cam, and the lift for the intake is 559 and the exhaust is 560. The duration is 280 and the lobe separation is 113, so it'll give a pretty good lopey idle there. And as you can see there, it says that the power for this is going to really be up above the 4,900 RPM range, and it's going to get up into the 7,000 range, which I don't know that I'll stay there often, but actually it says 3,500, but I've seen others that say 4,500. So, but that's the cam specifications we're going to go with, and the springs, the 26125-24, that's the one we went with. We just stuck with the plain steel retainers. There's no need in my case to go with the titanium that was offered. We did go with the cam phaser limiter kit 5449. Very simple kit, but make sure that you use extreme caution and read the directions and use those little tools that come with the kit, because you will lose a finger. These things are extremely strong. Okay, these are the lash adjusters, and while we had it out, we went ahead and inspected everything, and everything looked really well. The lash adjuster there on the left-hand side, that's an interesting little device. It's obviously a little different than what we're used to seeing in the old push rod motors. The little hole that's pointing up there, about 2/3 of the way up it, is where the oil gets sucked in, and then it obviously pumps out the top to the cam follower there on the right through that little hole, and it squirts up onto the actual cam lobes there. And what you'll have trouble with sometimes is these collapse. They don't hold up, and they will make a lot of noise, and there's actually some sort of a standard that you have to check them by. I think it's like 15 to 25 seconds under, when you're squeezing them with a big pair of channel locks or that type thing, and if they collapse down to all the way down, then they're no good. There is a standard that you can actually look up on the internet. If I can find it, I'll put it in here. Okay, the cam follower and the lash adjuster inspection. So make sure that you inspect the roller profile, the little wheel there. It shouldn't have any kind of movement up or down or left or right, and or any real extreme wear pattern actually on the roller. And the little hole there on the right hand side of that, where the lash adjuster fits into it, make sure that hole is good and clean, and it's not clogged up with any kind of garbage or anything like that. And make sure the wheel rolls, spin it over a few times, and make sure it doesn't have a whole lot of play in it. And then the lash adjuster, as we call the old traditionalist, we call the lifter. It's kind of an interesting little device in there. It's very similar, I guess, in nature to the lifters of yesteryear, but down at the bottom there I have it taken apart, and it was kind of interesting. I wanted to use one for measurements for the roller adjuster, the cam follower there. I was going to do some measurements, and it said to get all the oil out of it so that you can collapse it down with your finger and that type thing. So I started, it says to blow air into it after you collapse it and get the rest of the oil out of it. And you can blow air in the small little hole on the side. So I hooked the air hose up and I squeezed the trigger, and all of a sudden the piece right next to the little ring there, it's in the shape of a bullet, went flying across the room at about the speed of a bullet and bounced off 2 walls. And I was able to locate it, but if you want to disassemble them, that's, I guess, the easiest way, but do it with care. I would do it in some sort of rag or something so it wouldn't hurt anyone. But as you can see, there's the main body to the far left. There's a small spring, a small piece there. It has an actual check valve in it as well. It's a little ball and spring that wouldn't come apart. And then you have the main top, the point of it, and then the retainer ring. So if you want to make one for measurement, just take that main spring out and then reassemble everything. And that you can use for when you're doing your measurements. And that way you'll have something that's easy. You don't have to press down on it and wear your finger out. And I did find the specifications. It says use a pair of pliers and compress the lifter. If it collapses completely within 15 to 25 seconds, toss it, it's bad. So that's something you can kind of base your measurements off of, is just 15 to 25 seconds. But it should be rather firm when you're pumping it up underneath the oil there. Okay, so the lash adjuster, just one more time. The one on the left there is fully extended. That's fully pumped up with oil. And then, of course, the one on the right-hand side here is collapsed totally. And that's the hole that the oil gets sucked into. But I took the spring out so that I could use this and not have to press down on it and do all my measurements, because they want the measurements when you're measuring on base circle to have the lifter completely collapsed. Okay, so when I finally got ready to assemble it, I just went down to the local auto parts store there and grabbed a couple bottles of this Ultra Slick and read up it. It's pretty good stuff. There didn't seem to have any negative reviews on it or anything. It was cheap, so I grabbed a couple of bottles of that, and so you can use that or something similar. It doesn't matter as long as you have something really good in there. Some people just use oil. Some people use the 80-90 year lube for the rear end. They put it on there. Anything that kind of just sticks and make it stay so it won't start up dry. Okay, so once we got it all assembled, as you can see, there's the Ultra Slick all over the camshaft. It sticks like barbecue sauce. It's really sticky there, and it makes it good for that. So, but using the collapsed or the springless lash adjuster that I made, what you do is you want to measure. You want to turn the cam around over to where it's on its base circle. And to be honest with you, it's much easier to do out of the car. I ended up doing it in the car, which was a big mistake. So it's actually easier just to do it on the bench to turn the cam over. And but what you want to do is measure right between the roller follower wheel and the base circle. And Ford says that 18 to 33 thousandths is acceptable. So I ran into a lot of issues there where some of mine were much, much tighter. Mine were at 11,000, 10,000, but there was one that was 28 thousandths. But so what you have to do with that is if you have one that's outside of 33, say 38 or 40 thousandths, you would shim it. And the way you do it, you call up MMR, and they have these little shims. They look exactly like washers. You'd almost be tempted to run down to the local hardware store and buy these shims, but they only come in 25 thousandths, and they're $20, I think, for 36 of them. And what you do is you take the lash adjuster completely out, and you drop it down into the bore, and then you just put your lash adjuster back down inside. And then you take another measurement, and hopefully that will get you within the 18 to 33 thousandths. However, if it's too tight, like mine were, you actually have to grind the very base of the lash adjuster or lifter. It's not a machined finish on the very flat part. You'll see that as it comes down the body, it kind of tapers in a little bit, and then there's a flat bottom. You can actually just grind that, and I would suggest making a small jig or something like that if you don't have any way to do it perfectly. But what I did is I took a piece of angled aluminum and made a jig up next to the side of a grinding wheel, and I was able to just touch it and turn it as it went around. Then I would mic it out and see how many thousandths I was taking off, and I did real well. So I was able to get within the Ford standards of 18 to 33 thousandths. And then when you put the cam back in, obviously you want to torque down the bolts in a certain pattern and torque them down to 89 inch-pounds. That's what the book says to do. Okay, so another view of the cam installed. That's just before I slathered a whole bunch of that ultra slick stuff all over it. You can see the supercharger there in the back. That's the actual supercharger that's going back on the car. But overall, it was a pretty clean install. You know, I had some stuff we needed to fix from the remanufacturer heads, but other than that, it didn't go too bad. Okay, so on to these phasers. This is where I ran into a lot of problems. I put the whole thing back together, and I'd used the old phasers, didn't realize that they were bad. So when we put it together and started it up, it sounded as if someone was beating the hell out of the front of the engine there. And of course, everything goes through your head. Did I get the timing right? Did I forget to tighten up the bolts? Everything goes through your head. But then we found out that it was the cam phasers. Despite having the limiters in there, it still made a whole lot of noise. So trying to save money, I went down to, I believe it was Advanced Auto Parts, and purchased a cam phaser, thinking that it should be fine. So once we get it back to the bench there, we take it apart to switch the limiters over to this new Dorman phaser, and that's what we saw. As you can tell, the big difference in the internal workings of this. The one on the right hand side is the actual Ford old part, and the one on the left is the Dorman, the one with the yellow little inserts in it. And what we found is that the phaser limiter would not fit in there. It just would not fit due to the shape of the fingers on the limiter. It just would not go into that that cam phaser. So we got to looking around and found out that Comp does not make a phaser limiter that will fit anything except for genuine Ford parts. So I got to doing some research and come to find out that Dorman is one of the worst phasers that you can actually buy. They actually fall apart quite quickly. I've seen several hundred miles reported that they just finally come apart. And what you do is you check the little roller pins right in the front, right next to where the bolt that holds it on. You check that there's little roller pins there, and it'll actually move, and that's what creates all the noise when this thing is trying to adjust itself while the car is running. So that was the issue there. So I ended up having to bite the bullet and go down and buy the actual Ford cam phasers from the dealer, and wasn't a fun experience, but certainly made things easier when it came time to put the limiters in, and they fit absolutely perfectly. But that's what it looks like on the inside. So this is what the cam phaser limiter looks like. It's upside down, but it's over the top of the brand new cam phaser there in the back. It's on the Ford. And yeah, just you flip it over, and it'll only fit in there one way. You can't get it to go in backwards or anything else because it just won't line up. The bolt holes won't line up. So there's really only one way to put it in. And but it will not fit the Dorman, so don't try to buy any extra aftermarket type things because it just won't work. And remember, this is not a lockout. This is a limiter. And the limiter is to prevent you from losing the bottom end torque. And I certainly didn't want to lose anything there, so that's why I went with the limiters versus the lockouts that several other companies offer. So just make sure that you you follow the directions and use those tools to hold the spring back and that type thing. And I found doing it in a vise just locking it down in a vise real carefully made it real stable to actually use those tools, and it came out quite well. So this is what the actual phaser looks like installed. It actually takes the place of that plate that you see right above it there, which is just a flat circular plate that's normally on there. This one, it just takes the place of that, and I forget the torque specs on the little bolts there in the back, but I'm guessing around 80 or 90. I forget what exactly it was, but there's two of them that are longer than the other, and that's what you see the marks on the outside sprocket there. You'll see the C and the L or line mark. That was for this where the spring actually hooked onto the bolt. So those are the ones you got to be really careful with. Make sure that they go back in the proper hole there. Okay, so I finally reinstalled the motor, or got it set up ready to install. As you can see on the far right hand side there, it's basically ready to go in. And where you hook the chains, we hooked it on the back where the transmission bell housing hooks in to the back of the block. For example, the middle picture there, it would be the very back of the motor, our right-hand side from our perspective, and then the alternator bolt, which is on the right front here. In our perspective, it would be to the right, but if you're in the driver's seat, it would be to the left. But you lock down on that, and it lifts everything up with absolutely no problem. But we got everything installed with no issues. And that's the actual motor sitting in the car. We didn't want to put the manifold on because that was just more of an issue, trying to get everything installed, and it would be in the way. But the one on the far left-hand side is the engine in the car. So there's the entire thing, reconnected back to the transmission, and headers and that type thing. Something I forgot to mention. Yeah, I've got some long tube headers on there, and I've got some MagnaFlow exhaust, that type thing on there. Makes it sound real good. So all that was done to this engine and transmission, you can see it here, the 127-650, the limiters, valve springs, did the remanufactured heads, and got them all ported up. Lots of the assembly lube, all Ford timing components. Don't go with the cheap stuff. We ran into so many problems when I tried to go with the cheap stuff. So it's just best to go ahead and bite the bullet. You know what you're getting then. I was always an aftermarket guy until this instance here. Of course, using the Castrol 520 synthetic oil. Also, I heard that there are some issues with using other brand of oil filters on these cars. There's certain check valves or restriction or something like that. Read quite a bit about that, so we went ahead and went back with the Motorcraft oil filters. And the clutch that I had mentioned earlier, it's the Street Extreme clutch. Went ahead with that. Now the Motorcraft spark plugs, prior to me doing this work on this cam, I always ran the Autolite HT0s due to the supercharger. And I've gone through several sets of those, but once we put this cam in, the car would not start. No matter what we did, it would not start. It would try to start, and it would just stumble right to a stop. And I think the maximum RPM we'd get is about 1,000, and that was only literally for a few seconds. So thanks to Marty up at Ford Performance, I spent many hours on the phone with him dealing with this issue, and also over at Comp Cam, Dallas. Dallas was a real lifesaver as well. Spent quite a bit of time on the phone with him wondering why this car would not start. We tried literally everything. We scanned, we did relative compression, we did actual compression ratio checks. We've done everything to this engine until one day Marty said, why don't you just go ahead and put a Motorcraft spark plug back in it and get a little bit hotter. What you could be doing is blowing the flame out. With this bigger cam, you got more air and everything coming into it. It might be blowing that out. So decided, okay, I'll go ahead and bite the bullet on that. And those were just as expensive as the HT0 Autolites. And so decided to give those a shot and put them in. and the car fired right up and ran. It was absolutely incredible. We'd spent so much time and wasted so much money on everything, and all it was the actual spark plug. So if you run into this kind of issue, take a look at the spark plug. It's odd that that happened, but that's what fixed mine. But it was an interesting suggestion, and I'm glad I listened to him. These guys are absolute experts, both Dallas at Comp Cam and Marty over at Ford Performance. Well, that's my journey putting these cams in. The car runs extremely strong. I have yet to get it dynoed. Prior to this, I was running right around 600 rear wheel horsepower, and I forget the torque specs. I've got the dyno sheets somewhere. We ran it 2 or 3 times on the dyno, and it's been run on a different one. And it was within 15 horsepower between the two types of dynos. And really pleased with the horsepower, you know, the torque, that type thing with these cams. So I had a tune put in by Tony, and just a base tune to get it down there. But I have yet to get it down there to get it fully dyno tuned, that type thing. But I'll get that done, and I'll post a video of it actually being dyno tuned. See where we're at on the numbers. Stay tuned. Thanks for listening.